All right, good afternoon. Are we recording? Yes. Great. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marty West, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And today I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, John White. John is currently the Chief Success Officer at Great Minds, which is one of the leading curriculum companies in the United States. But he has a lot of experiences to draw upon in talking with us today. He previously served for 8 years as the Louisiana State Superintendent of Education, where he oversaw over that time period the fastest improving state in the nation, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Before being state superintendent, he was the superintendent of the Louisiana Recovery School District, where he led really the transformation of the New Orleans schools in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And before that, he worked with Chancellor Joel Klein in the New York City public schools. So, as I said, a lot to draw upon. Today, he's going to be talking on why higher education remains the most important influence on K-12 education policy. I was excited when I read that title, but there's this parentheses in the middle, the most intransigent influence as well. So I didn't like that part of the title, but we'll ask him to defend that perspective. So thanks, John.
Great. Thank you, Marty. It's great to be here. I'll tell you just a little bit of my background. I was 7 years ago now. It's amazing to say. I spent a semester teaching with Paul Peterson in a graduate course here, and had the incredible experience of immersing myself with a group of students here at the Kennedy School and at the Graduate School of Education. I ended up hiring a bunch of them, and just found it to be the most delightful thing to kind of talk about not just education, but public service, and to be surrounded by people who are thinking about their role in our nation's institutions. I think right now, both globally and domestically, it goes without saying, the seriousness with which our institutions are managed is under grave threat. And to have a group of young people in your midst who at worst are just thinking about, and maybe at best are taking a step inside those institutions, to me is greatly inspiring. And so I have a chance to come back and just spend a little bit. I spent an hour and a half this morning with some undergraduates across campus, talking later today with some graduate students. And I'm very grateful to be here today. So thank you to Marty and Paul and everybody else, Michael and Antonio and others who have invited me here. In my classes today, I'm talking about K-12 school accountability, which is a great topic and one of great importance, and badly in need of understanding, and frankly, badly in need of progress and evolution. But I thought that for our lunch, given that this is a little more casual and maybe spontaneous, given an open canvas to just say what I wanted to talk about, I thought I would just come and throw out a couple of provocations to you, and maybe we could just have a discussion about it. And in particular, given Harvard's place in the world, given higher education being what it is, and given the current politics of higher education, I wanted really to talk about something that I am gravely troubled by, that is kind of in the realm of higher education, but it's something that is really not discussed and is not often associated with higher education. So this is a kind of provocation, maybe a view on how the world could be better, and really just a hope for a conversation about challenges and opportunities that are in our midst, especially as regards young people who have left our secondary system and are entered our post-secondary context. Let me make just three kind of bundles of observations about kids who are, maybe we'll call them late stage adolescents, early stage adults. You've probably read a lot of headlines about attendance in schools today. The landscape around what is expected in terms of school attendance, in terms of the affinity that kids have for coming to schools, by the way, the affinity that teachers have for coming to schools too, has fundamentally changed over the last 5 years. And I think the reporting on this has been significant, and even then underdone. The percentage of kids who are attending a school where chronic absenteeism is a de facto condition is shocking. This is disproportionate to high schools, and it's disproportionate to Black and Latino youth in America. And that in and of itself, late adolescent disengagement from education institutions is a crisis. Higher education enrollment has stabilized, but it's stabilized against an already declining trend. And that too is troubling. And colleges are beginning to experience, both because of birth cohorts and also because of just a general disengagement from education institutions, a reduction that also is having a disproportionate effect on young people of color and young people from lower economic means. Secondly, before all of that, there was already the fact that the high school diploma in and of itself was declining in terms of its economic value and its relevance in the real world. And, just we spent the morning talking about accountability. It is true that accountability has basically eradicated the high school dropout crisis in America. There really isn't much of a high school dropout crisis in America, except in maybe a small handful of pockets. What there is a life dropout crisis for a bunch of people who have high school degrees and have no economic prospects. And this is a crisis, and it's not discussed. And the third thing that I would observe is it's not for lack of attention to the politics of higher education. I would say that higher education politics actually take up more of today's airspace than do K-12 politics, weirdly enough, in spite of the efforts of Ron DeSantis and others. But it is because the media and maybe our own kind of desire to look up at places like Harvard are so interested in talking about issues like admissions, issues like the positions that young people take on college campuses, issues like loan forgiveness or debt relief, or whatever you want to call it. We are so enthralled with the politics of youths who are on college campuses in place that embody the highest level of our aspiration, certainly Harvard, no exception to that. That really the popular dynamic, I mean, if you open up the New York Times, that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the vast, vast majority, truly the vast majority of young people who are not enrolled in a selective four-year institution. They're 18 to 22, but they're not enrolled in a four-year selective institution. It's unlikely that they're enrolled in a two-year institution. If they are enrolled in a two-year institution, it's unlikely that they complete that institution. And instead are in and out of educational institutions, in and out of work, in a world that requires them to be credentialed in order for them to gain meaningful employment, in order for them to generate upward mobility, meaning that the popular dialogue, and I would say that the solutions are out of touch with the population. And I think on some level, that is because it is not really clear whose responsibility that group of kids is. And I'll call them kids. They are not, at least technically, the kind of under the stewardship of legal guardians or parents. They are not any longer, because we have so fetishized the high school diploma as a kind of culminating point in our high schools, they are not the responsibility of our school boards and our secondary system. And the higher education system is a collection of individual institutions rather than a system that operates, whether this people don't like to say it this way, but largely by way of a market, actually not a very heavily regulated market. And it is not a market that insists on a kind of census level collective participation in the way that the mandates of K-12 education do. So it's not really clear that if you've satisfied your enrollment mandates as an institution of higher learning, you have any legal or moral mandate to reach out to a kid who is challenging to serve and who, in my view, most importantly, doesn't do the thing, doesn't need the thing, or isn't asking for the thing, or isn't qualified for the thing that the government is paying you to do. Meaning, whatever the ability of your students here at Harvard or anywhere else to pay on their own for tuition, the truth of it is that the federal government's regulatory and paying power is the predominant influence over institutions' programming, that what they accredit is the kind of stick in exchange for the carrot of the financial largesse of the federal government, and that in spite of modest innovations that are being made by higher ed institutions across the country, it is still the case that whether it's GI Bill whether it's other Title IV provisions like the Pell Grant system and so on, effectively, if you're a higher education administrator in a institution that doesn't have the options that Harvard does, one of the questions you must be asking is, how many young people in our bachelor's programs are we going to enroll and thus be paid by the federal government and to some extent to state governments for servicing? And whatever you think of that system, whether you think the admissions policies are fair, whether you think that the debt administration has been conducted equitably or should be addressed in some other way, those debates are important, and I don't want to diminish them for a second, but they're not really talking about the vast majority of kids who will never be in a position to benefit from more magnanimous admissions or debt relief policy. And the politics of higher education, and I would argue the funding structures, as well as the media, have fundamentally ignored a crisis that the pandemic has really existed well before, but has accelerated. School systems have wiped their hands clean by basically just graduating everybody and said, we've done our part. And so you now have youths, let's call them roughly 18 to 21, but I think you could extend that further, who have need of institutional stewardship in a world that is demanding a credential beyond the high school diploma, but for which there is not only no institution that is morally or legally responsible, but where there is no payer. And this is I think, in my view, kind of the critical failure of the policy construct today. Isn't that we should be blaming Harvard for not enrolling more of such kids. Harvard could certainly have its own discussions about that and make accommodations, but it's a problem that exists far beyond the scale of individual institutions. It's instead that the way that the incentives, the financial incentives work within the system simply do not give that kid who actually needs the resources, the financial leg up, the continued stewardship of institutions, in my view, more than anyone else. It doesn't provide them with a viable higher education alternative that doesn't come with all the opportunity costs that a bachelor's degree comes with, or the pursuing one comes with, and that provides economic mobility and the ability to work, generate a work history, to earn, to not accrue debt, while at the same time it is generating the education credentials you do need ultimately to accelerate your career beyond entry-level work. This is something that is possible. It's being done in pockets around the country, but the inability to translate those pockets where working, and learning, where the role of the employer and the role of the education institution are intermingled. The inability to lift up that possibility, to put the muscle of the paying government behind it, and to kind of veil all of these things in the rhetoric of employers need more labor, the labor markets are tight, they're going to pay for the solutions. There is no evidence of that whatsoever, that employers are going to step in on their own because of market incentives and subsidize the upward mobility and education credentialing of 18 to 21-year-olds with low skill levels who are not being admitted to four-year institutions. No evidence of that at all. So the rhetoric is off, the policymaking seriousness is off. And that's really in spite of some evidence out there of programs that actually work. Just to name some, the United States military, as one example, is admittedly a moderately selective institution, but that has for years operated as a working and learning combination, government paid, employer driven solution to elevate people's professional prospects while they do not accrue debt by mingling working and learning through a government paid solution. I founded a nonprofit organization with a Bostonian that Marty and Paul know well, who I believe has been a visitor here at Harvard, Payman Ruhanafard, who was, like me, a former superintendent, called Propel America. This year we'll have 1,000 young people coming out of some of the lowest income school systems in the country, obtaining entry-level work within some of the largest healthcare chains in the country, including here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, who are immediately placed after brief education programs in patient care technician, certified medical assistant roles and technician roles, earning wages of $20, $30, even sometimes $40 an hour, and at the same time able to go to school, because we have convinced education institutions to modify the way they do their programming to figure out how to make a Pell Grant actually work in a context where the learning isn't so kind of serial as a bachelor's degree followed by a career, but more intermingled. But even on a more notable basis, a program like Year Up, for example, founded in Boston, has for years trained individuals coming out of challenging circumstances to be immediately employable in those in white collar working environments. Which is all to say that there are pockets of excellence happening around the country in what I would call broadly post-secondary education, where kids are working and learning. There are also international examples, and this is obviously well rehearsed, but of countries who actually have serious governing models that bring employers together with higher ed institutions or post-secondary training institutions to define a curriculum, to pay for participation in that curriculum, to subsidize the education experience, and to guarantee a pathway into given work upon completion of education programming. So there's evidence abroad that this can work. But we continue to be to fetishize the politics of exclusive four-year institutions and the social justice politics of our debt system in a way that, in my view, distracts from where the real underlying crisis is. All to say, I've come to think that the solution to all of this is not going to come from employers. I just don't think at the end of the day, the employer's incentive to take on the challenges that come with the education and the support of late stage adolescents who, for all of their beautiful attributes, are hard to deal with at times. I just don't think that's a moral mandate that employers are ever really going to accept at great scale. I don't think this is going to be solved by cities. And tragically, while I think there can be models started with states, I don't think that at the end of the day, states are going to be able to create a financial incentive that differs widely from the federal incentive system. I do believe that change is needed to the way that the federal government subsidizes higher education institutions or allows states to subsidize higher education institutions, such that states can begin to pay organizations to do something that is fundamentally different from what higher ed institutions today believe they are paid to do and the way that they are accredited. Ultimately, I believe that at a state and local level, that money needs to make its way down to two sorts of organizations. First are organizations, and these exist to some degree in Australia and in the UK, whose job it is to take on some of the risk of employing young people, to say, we will put you on our payroll as an intermediary organization, a bridge that subsidizes you and that coaches you and supports you in the bridge to employment and education. And secondly, the willingness of state governments to subsidize both accredited and non-accredited organizations to provide educational services that are not so serial as a 2-year degree and then employment, or a 4-year degree and then employment, but that actually challenge some of the current rules that govern accreditation, and thus the rules that institutions have to follow in order to receive Title IV support from higher education. If the federal government were to change the way that it funds, if states were to work with them and actually using their ability to subsidize organizations to do something different for this particular population than they have done historically, we would actually start to provide a viable system of higher education alternatives for kids who are not in a position, for whatever reason, to enroll in four-year institutions. We would create a challenger, and it's a badly, badly needed challenge to the conventional broken model of associate's degrees. By the way, there's a lot of rhetoric, especially on the left, about community colleges and how great they are. Tragically, there's not much evidence that community colleges at scale are great at completing degrees and are great at economic mobility and leading directly to jobs. There's the need for new models and incentive for community colleges to break out of the accreditation limited models that happen today. But I actually think in some sense, the best thing that could happen from a higher education system that actually offers a faster path to work without sacrificing the long-term prospect of education. Again, a less serial program of higher education, is that it would send a signal to the K-12 education that is different from the signal that it receives today, about what real success looks like for a graduate from high schools. Our high schools today get one signal. And in our state, it's purple and gold, Friday night, a free education at Saturday night. That was a big mistake. A free education at LSU. Right? The LSU Tigers and a full ride to attend LSU, to go to the ball games on Saturday night in Death Valley. That's what success in Louisiana and every state of its ilk means. That symbolic cue to the school system is the cue that its school boards and the state board, I know I'm speaking state board member here, take to say, we're going to design our program of education around that definition of success. And it really doesn't matter that 2/3 of the kids will never complete that definition of success after they graduate from college, because there is no competing vision for what success is for a young adult after they've left high school. Why is there no competing vision? Because there's no funded alternative to that vision. And every other higher education alternative in Louisiana is really just a derivative of that Saturday night at LSU and Death Valley vision. Yes, it may be at a less selective institution, but ultimately the signal that high schools get is success for your kids is going on to complete a 4-year institution from 18 to 22. And it doesn't matter what the facts tell you about what's required for jobs. And it doesn't matter what the facts tell you about debt. And it doesn't matter what the facts tell you about how many kids are really, truly likely to complete that degree. That is a shame, because the signal that is sent to school systems then is every kid, one path. There is no real viable alternative. And the truth of it is, they're kind of right. There is no real viable alternative. So what I'm arguing for, and it's probably a much more nuanced and complicated discussion than we can get to fully here today, but is that for a higher education system that looks different, that has a different model, that the model for young people is less about go get a degree and then get a job, but it's more about get a degree while you have a job. And that in order for higher ed institutions to actually embrace that model, they'll need to shake free of the accreditation limits that are placed on them today, and they will need the financial incentives to do that. The payer is what matters, and the payer needs to change the rules around which it pays to foment that model. The power would be actually a chance for the many, many kids in my state, the second poorest state in this country, and even here in Massachusetts, who are not going, not certainly to Harvard, not just LSU, but to Northwestern State in Louisiana. For all the kids who are not going there, which is most, by the way, in America, most, to say there's an alternative, puts money in my pocketbook, doesn't allow me to take on debt, and allows me to get my work history and my education history as we go forward. The fact that we are not doing this is a tragedy. We're obsessed with the politics of places like Harvard, and we're ignoring the millions and millions of kids in that situation. I'd love to have a dialogue about this. I really appreciate the chance to come and talk about it here, and appreciate you guys joining me for lunch. Yes.
Thanks so much.
No, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, no, let's start a conversation.
Yeah, well, actually, they're not nearly so consequential as they are perceived to be. My experience with federal regulation is that it's so vast, and it creates pockets of clout within institutions, higher ed and K-12, of people who are expert in it but not because they know how to manipulate it. It's just because they are expert in the most conventional interpretations of it. So there are course hour limitations to the extent to which a student has to be enrolled in taking specific courses in order for a program at a school to be accredited. If you are accredited as a community college and you're operating let's call it a nursing program, whether it's a 2-year or 4-year program, students can't just be going for one course 1 hour a week. They have to be a serious full-time student in order to draw down Pell support. Well, the community colleges across the country have interpreted this in a pernicious way, which is by dividing the accredited side of the house which is the Pell Grant accepting side of the house, or as it's often called, the academic side of the house, as opposed to the workforce side of the house, which is the Adult Education, Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act funded, which is a much more flexible, but ultimately much, much more limited funding stream that is meant for a different population. So what has happened? There's one side of the community college, and I'm going to pick on community colleges mostly here, that is run for, let's call it young people, the intention of which is to go for 2 years and then transfer to a 4-year institution. And then there's another side of the house that is run for adults that is meant to lightly subsidize their training models, but to give nothing nearly what the Pell Grant allows for and other more conventional accredited financial aid comes with. Now, creative people can say, I don't want either of those things. I actually want a workforce training program for young people. I want it to lead to an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. And I'm going to spend tons and tons of time figuring out how to re-engineer my program to do that. But, and some of you may be familiar with this, that takes a level of institutional reform that most community colleges just simply are not accustomed to, capable of, and skilled at. And it's not really it's just not the way the system is set up. I mean, the system is set up to basically create those two silos. So what we've done at Propel America is to try to find institutions that are willing to step into that breach and to run programs that do marry the workforce side with the accredited side, that do say, yes, you're technically enrolled in a bachelor's of nursing program, but our real goal for this year is to get you nursing assistant certified and placed in that role. And then we're going to take the next step to your phlebotomist role and the next step to your nursing role ultimately. That's just a very, very unconventional and rare institution that is really willing to break down what are very entrenched silos. I mean, it would be like going to Harvard and saying, we're going to merge two colleges. You know, it's just culturally anathema to the way the place operates.
So let me pick up on that if that's all right, because it follows straight on it. So, I mean, the most straightforward way to act on the vision, and it would only be part of acting on it, but to act on the vision that you laid out here would be to allow Pell Grants and federally backed student loans to be used not just at accredited institutions of higher education, but at some broader set of organizations that are doing the type of programming that you're saying would be so valuable. But currently, right, you can only take Title IV funds, as we call them, to accredited institutions. So you said higher ed's not a very regulated market, but actually that's a pretty fundamental regulation on entry into the market and innovation. So why is it that accreditation is the gatekeeper for Title IV aid? Well, historically, it's because the federal government couldn't find another way to sort of do quality control in the higher ed space. So they created the GI Bill, and they wanted to make sure that veterans were taking federal funds to institutions that would actually serve them and not to fly-by-night providers of various kinds. And so they asked the accreditors, which pre-existed as sort of regional clubs that were sort of self-improvement entities, they asked them to take on this different role, but it was to solve that problem of quality control. So I guess all this is leading to the question, like, how do we do quality control in this space that is very, I don't think we yet have the one model that works to do workforce preparation in the way that you're talking about. Is there some sort of outcomes-based approach that we could think about using?
Yeah, let me just sort of pontificate on a couple of dimensions of that. First, I do think that the politics of the Higher Education Act are troubling from two vantage points. One, there are cultural and social interests that Republicans and Democrats have that are in particular Title IX, that make the legislation just hard to talk about and hard to move. But also, it's amazing, as you know, Marty, when you're on the Hill, how conservative the liberals are, on higher education reform. And it's also, I think, to some degree, amazing how defensive the conservatives are of some bad actors in the market. But I do think that the kind of the politics of the for-profit institutions has poisoned the well on this issue to a great extent. There is a broad, what I'm talking about, by the way, I don't think is broadly debatable, or in the sense that you shouldn't care about this group of kids. I don't think the social justice or civil rights mandate of what I'm talking about is something that Republicans or Democrats would broadly contest. It is, by and large, the fear of abuse and the fear of regulators that I think separate Democrats and Republicans. In my experience, that is a hard thing to get past on Capitol Hill itself. And in some case, it raises questions then of, is Congress capable of being the first mover? Because for all of its powers, the Department of Education is not really going to be the first mover in Washington. And I think Congress's levers around, as we were talking about earlier, around not just writing a check, but actually deriving measurable value are blunt and in many cases not very good. I do think probably the best scenario is if there were a state that was actually willing to see the political value in developing such a system, to use as evidence to Congress that actually this type of system is workable at some scale. I think most best social policy, domestic policy, and certainly education legislation starts with the idea actually having been done in practice. And I have a sense that both politically as well as just operationally, the best answer is probably not to think of the federal government as the first mover, but to think of a state in partnership with the federal government building something at some reasonable scale that becomes a model for how Title IV could work better in the end, including the measurement instruments and actually a definition of what the right outcomes look like. I will say I worked for Mike Bloomberg, Bobby Jindal, John Bell Edwards, who's just will be leaving office in a couple of months. And it has been, not to throw a wet blanket on things, it has been striking how different chief executives are of these large systems in terms of their desire to manage the politics of higher education themselves. And this is, in some sense, I think, the greatest challenge to what I just articulated, which is that on some level, higher ed in that context, not as much here, I don't think, but in that context, there is a food fight among every institution that is laying claim to a young person. And stepping into that void means you have to take a side on some level politically. You can't say, I want a new model that's going to be attractive to a new set of kids and not have all the other higher ed institutions pissed off at you. And I think on some level, that's why Bobby Jindal failed to really re-engineer in our state higher education, and his successor just showed no interest in really taking it on. And so I'm not trying to say that the challenges of actually creating a new model are easy. This is a long-term thing, but I guess it's to say, I think that probably, to all your points, the best answer is not that those issues get worked out originally among committee staff in Washington. It's probably that they get worked out in the real world.
Yeah, I'm a visitor. I'm a visiting professor here. I'm from University of California system. And my background is science, but I spent a lot of time working with K-12 to try to bring it up. And what you say about being afraid to do things in the government, it's true, both sides. And in our state, we have an economy that's the size of many countries, more. And yet our education, if you look at our placement of students, we're somewhere around 45 or 46 in the country. It's just not working. The only governor who was able to put through just because he wanted to do it and didn't care what people thought was Schwarzenegger. I guess I call him the Terminator for a reason. And so that work, and my question is there any possibility that that's at that level, if you had a coalition of governors that agree to go to Congress, because they represent states and they all know the problems, but you run into the problem that you just mentioned. But if there was a coalition of them, it seems like they'd have a lot more sway if they're going to the national level, or is that just totally undoable? Like I said, in science about.
Yeah, no, I think, and this is the issue is that when there is a vacuum of responsibility, meaning this issue is not landing in anyone's lap. These are the disenfranchised. I mean, take California. I mean, there's no state that has more big P politics in higher education than California. But for as really remarkable a community college system as California has, it still is the 4-year, the two big 4-year systems and their politics that really drive the discussion in California. Stepping into that is a very, very hard thing to do. And it takes a willingness to want to manage your systems as the governor. In my time, have only really encountered actually in Tennessee. I mean, Tennessee feels to me like the state that has most seriously taken responsibility for central management of the performance and the data that evaluate its higher education system, and has made a pretty elegant trade for money in exchange for performance. Not perfect at all. And I would still say in Tennessee's case, they've done it largely by subsidizing the conventional system rather than by and asking the conventional system to get unconventional outcomes, rather than by trying to foment something fundamentally different. I think the politics on this will break at some point. I think that this is such a need. But so long as the Democrats can kind of make hay with their concerns about debt relief and some of the kind of more admissions related concerns and student body makeup, and so long as the Republicans can just slam higher education and say, that's their higher education platform right now, is we don't like higher ed. I mean, and the numbers are just through the roof. But there is no skilled workforce reform without higher ed. I mean, the workforce system in America doesn't exist. I mean, it is a unemployment insurance system, and it's really nothing else. The workforce skilling programs that are government subsidized and government run, that is not a real system of any consequence. So the scaled, capitalized system of workforce preparation is higher ed. So the Republicans are going to have to get over their aversion to higher ed, and the Democrats are going to have to get over their fetishizing of elite institutions. And someone will break through this logjam. Jared Polis in Colorado feels like he's kind of knocking on that door, and he's the type of governor who could do that. But there aren't many instances of the seriousness and the long-term orientation as governors that it would take to do it. So to answer your question, is there a coalition? I don't see a lot of Democrat and Republican governors showing up in Washington together anymore. I don't see a lot of presidents or secretaries who have the kind of platform to invite them to that discussion. And I wish I could give a rosier picture on that. I'm optimistic that it will happen because I think the mandate, in a sense, is there, but it doesn't feel like the politics right now really support it.
It's why you put all the burden of the workforce development on higher education. It seems to me you're letting the secondary schools off the hook, and they're failing in so many areas. I mean, just as you were saying earlier, pushing everybody to graduate doesn't mean everybody is prepared.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You're not speaking about what the responsibility and possibilities of reforming and creating really different alternative high school experiences for many kids.
Yeah. Well, that's a fair critique. It's my position on it is probably a little bit more nuanced, but you're right that there's a reason that was kind of left out. Let me explain why. One, it's not what they are told to do. Now, you could change what you tell them to do, but it's not what they are told to do. High schools are told. You have 4 subjects and a bunch of ancillary subjects. You have a bunch of extracurriculars. Go do these things, and if kids broadly meet the requirements, you should give them a diploma. And if every kid gets a diploma and broadly meets the requirements, you get a high grade. That is in their DNA. That's what they do. They don't do much else. That's what they do. The rhetoric that is kind of out there and that is politically popular to trot out around career and technical education programs in the high schools, we need more of that. We need more hands-on learning, all that, would have you think that a high school in its career and technical education programming is a capable staffing agency or preparer of kids for 21st century upwardly mobile careers. And I just don't see any evidence of that. It's not to say that it couldn't happen. I just see no evidence of it in school's current incarnations. So part of what you're hearing from me is a reaction to the rhetoric that I hear a lot, which is, well, high schools should start training kids. Well, I mean, that's very, very far from where they are right now. And I see a lot of energy and money going into that line of thinking without much result. Secondly, I think that's partially just a function of what the policy and politicians have asked them to do. But it's a somewhat of a reaction to adolescence too. I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, but I think it's fair to say we all can observe adolescence being a kind of an extended state. That it is fair to say that the number of 17 and 8-year-olds coming out of school, without the need for a kind of bridge experience and ready to meet the demands of a fully autonomous, employed, self-sustaining life, that number's got to be getting smaller. And I think if you view high school's purpose as, at its essence, a kind of basic grounding in what it means to be an adult citizen, then adolescents are going to continue. I'm not saying that they are, but even were they, that's a different thing from equipping somebody to walk into yeah.
To work in the day and having high school for them in the evening.
Yes, I absolutely. It's just to say that I think there is a bridge, both chronologically and kind of daily, in terms of the experience of a young person, between what they get in their formal secondary education and being a reliable, independent, employable adult that existed when high schools were better at providing a direct path to work. Unions, as one example, were oftentimes providing much of that kind of intermediary bridge between a high school and a career. So even though somebody was coming out with just a high school degree and no credential, the fact that they were going through an apprentice program meant that they were employable. It wasn't just the high school that made them employable. And given the technical demands of today's what I'll call upwardly mobile work, economically viable work, I just don't see high schools alone being able to serve the staffing needs. Could they be doing better? Absolutely. Would a shift in higher education's way of operating signal to them that there is the possibility of doing some things differently? Yes. And part of the reason that I think this conversation is so important is I see high schools making that shift. And this is new thinking for me, because I've been trying for years to sort of push high schools in the direction you're articulating. I think high schools will be more equipped to make that shift in an earnest way. True shifts in the curriculum, true shifts in how kids are spending their time, once an economically viable model that is not this has been demonstrated. In the absence of this, in the absence of an alternative to this, they're just doing the same thing year over year. And the dirty little secret is, and actually Mike Petrilli of Fordham wrote a compelling piece on this morning. It's about time in kids' lives. I mean, their time is taken up, whether they're ever going to a four-year institution or not, with basically watered down preparation for a four-year institution. That's what's taking up their time, as well as whatever time the football coach or the band leader or whatever wants from them every day. And serious career preparation, by and large, is not happening because the claims from different interest groups and a different vision of success is what's the influence over their schedule.
Oh,
So John, this is really a great topic and you've identified as, serious problem. People, age 17, what are they gonna do for the next 8 years of their life? And institutions are not responding to that. And you're really criticizing the high schools, you're criticizing the community college, you're criticizing the four-year colleges. No one is really stepping into a space that is, needs to be built. There's a lot of people in this category that, whose needs are not being addressed. But I don't see that the idea that the federal government, by giving more money, can do this, or some leaving it up to some creative state governor or something like that. It seems to me you got to have a more bottom-up solution to this than the top-down solution that I hear you reaching for. And the bottom-up solution that's out there is the education savings account, which I think is too much focused on elementary schools, secondary school, really not at all addressing this issue. So would you propose, say, education savings account 2.0 that would tell anybody once they reach the age of 16 and have finished their compulsory education years, that they're going to have 4 years of support for the education that they want? And they can choose the institution they want to have it at. And they can either use it to complete their high school diploma, or they can use it to go to Portel America, or they can use it to go to a community college that's really meeting their needs. So you give the student the flexibility to find a place.
Yeah.
I believe the institutions will adapt quickly if the students have the capacity to make choices. But right now, students have to obey the regulations. They really, the choice is very limited because they have no control over the choice.
Yeah, and I do agree with what you're articulating. I see that in the same vein as a state stepping up and actually leading to create something new. I mean, I think the ESAs have both great potential with some guidance, and also they run the risk of just being sort of trinkets and not being substantive and scalable. And I do think this is an area where if states can dedicate capital that is more dynamic, that is, if I can say this, a little bit more risk oriented, and allows the dollars to flow to institutions that don't have to meet all of the regulatory standards that the federal government has imposed on higher education. Yeah, I think that's a incredibly viable option. I don't think it will happen without leadership. And I think on the right now, there was a recently elected governor in Louisiana, for example, elected last weekend. And his mantra on education is just kind of choice for choice's sake. I do think that the purpose of markets in education, while I don't want to control individuals' choices within the market, I do think that the incentives are effectively implicit value systems, and someone needs to create those incentives, and those incentives should be directed at certain purposes. And yes, I think that however you get there, whether it's through a market or whether it's through a more conventional subsidy, there should be states leading on the subsidization of entities that are capable of playing the role that I've described as a competitive threat to standard institutions, and as a way that standard institutions can enter a market and do something new. So I'm all for that. I think the greatest hope we have, and I think the state, maybe the city, but I think the state is the right level of governance for this, is leadership being willing to recognize that new sources of capital are needed. A new payer is needed, whether the purchasing power is in the hands of the kid or otherwise, or the family or otherwise. And that secondly, a new sort of institution, a new behavior in conventional institutions is the result that is desirable. And yes, I think your point is right. I think ESAs represent an opportunity if the regulator is able to say, and these are the sorts of purposes that we want those dollars ultimately going toward. I have not seen that level of intentional design yet of ESA systems for older kids. I see for the most part, more of a kind of conventional elementary and middle grade standard fare orientation in the ESAs.
So maybe one last question, John. So there's a group here at Harvard of faculty called, I think, the Project on the Workforce or the Future of the Workforce. And one of the things they're very interested in doing is trying to identify people in the labor market who don't have a bachelor's degree, but who are skilled through alternative routes or STARs, as they call them. And they've been pushing for state governments, other large employers to stop using the bachelor's degree as a hiring requirement for many positions. Is that sort of agenda essential for what you're talking about here to really achieve its full potential? Is it something that is nice and would accelerate it? Do you see it as unrelated at all?
I see it as really important. So, this is the idea that there are millions of Americans, which I think is demonstrably true, who have education credentials and a work history that make them viable, upwardly mobile, eligible, capable of greater things with modest tweaks in their skills, capable of upskilling. I think the kind of advent of analyzing people's skills in ways that are much more nuanced than just what degree you have, and then being able to act on that by targeting and skilling them is hugely important. However, I think it just to say this, it can be conflated with what I'm talking about in ways that I think is dangerous. Because if you are an employer, let's say in a large Fortune 500 company, you're looking at somebody who has 10 years of work history and maybe even modest management experience, who has experience working with different systems and software, who's credentialed maybe in some of those applications, but who never got their bachelor's degree. And you're saying, with just a little bit of upskilling, they could actually be a general manager in this business. Yes, that's a social justice, civil rights, that's an important thing. But the value of that to a company is not lost on them. I mean, the incentives for a modest investment in education in order for the return of somebody that they just weren't able to recognize through the less nuanced bachelor's degree screen, that's value. I'm not talking about something that's necessarily of obvious economic value. I don't know that I could recommend to the average hospital that we work with at Propel America that your best candidate pool is 18-year-olds. I don't think I can credibly say that. But it is a social issue, and so there are principles that I think are the same, which is skills before degrees, anchoring yourself in the world of work, and not accepting the conventions as the only way of valuing skills or quantifying them. But the thing that differs is that, to me, feels like a kind of accelerant to a market dynamic that already exists and that we just needed to be enlightened about. This feels like a moral calling that, whoever you place the burden on needs to be accepted, or we will have enhanced economic inequities that will worsen over the generations.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer. Thank you for an interesting conversation.
Thank you.